My name is Pat Byrne. I'm a faculty member in Soil and Crop Sciences at Colorado State University. My specialty is plant breeding and genetics. And as part of that, I have done some outreach on genetically modified crops. What are they? How are they used in our food supply? Should we be concerned about them? This will be a two-part webinar. The first part, I will talk about just basic information about GM crops, what are their current types that we're using, some of the future applications. And then the second part will be how are GM crops made and what are some of the risks and concerns. So I'm titling this Facts and Fiction about GMO crops. There's been a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about GMO crops, so I hope to clear some of that up. An outline, I will provide some introductory material on plant breeding. I'll intersperse some quiz questions on GM crops and their impact, talk about current crops in the marketplace, and then future applications. Now, one of the features of this debate is how polarized it is. We have very positive images, as shown on the left, for example, the papaya that saved the Hawaiian papaya industry. And we have very scary images and messages about frankenfoods and weird hybrids. To my mind, both of these extreme points of view are misleading. There's a midpoint, and that's what I would like to see occur in our discussion of GM crops, is common ground where the proponents would acknowledge that yes, there are some concerns that need to be addressed, and the opponents would acknowledge that maybe these do have a useful role in our food supply if evaluated carefully. One example of this polarization is shown here. This is the results of a survey from about 2 years ago, showing a very wide difference in opinions between the public and scientists on the safety of GMO foods. So there are two bars here. One is from AAAS scientists. That's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a very large scientific organization. And they were asked, do you consider GMO foods to be generally safe or unsafe? 88% of the scientists felt generally safe. In contrast, general population of US adults asked the same question. Only 37% felt that GMO foods were generally safe. That's a huge gulf between the scientist and the general public. And my point is not to say that one side is wrong and one side is right, but just to demonstrate there's a big gap in understanding. So what are genetically modified GM or GMO plants? GM indicates gene transfer using recombinant DNA technology, which is a set of laboratory techniques for cloning, splicing, and transferring DNA. Usually the gene being transferred is between species that are not sexually compatible. And that's really what gives the technology its power, that genes can be transferred between species, for example, between a bacteria and a plant, between an animal and a plant. These transfers that could not take place naturally. Synonyms are genetically engineered, or GE, transgenic, and transformed. So I will use all of these terms to mean the same thing. I should point out that hybrid does not mean the same thing as GMO. Hybrid is a very different technology. It just means crossing of two different strains of a plant to get a product that is better than either of the parents. So some hybrids are GMOs, and some GMOs are hybrids, but not all of them are. So they're two very different types of technology. I happen not to like the term genetically modified or GM very much, even though I use it. And the reason is that we have been genetically modifying crops for a very, very long time. Most of our major crops were domesticated from 8 to 10,000 years ago in different parts of the world. This image is meant to represent early farmers in the Middle East who were harvesting wild wheat and barley on a hillside. And in the process, they were selecting for plants that had bigger seeds, that had seeds that stayed on the plant instead of being scattered, selecting plants that were inherently more drought tolerant and disease resistant. And in the process, they were modifying the genetics of that population. Another example is the cabbage family. From the wild cabbage that occurs in Western Europe, kale was developed, and then many other forms of the cabbage family that we enjoy almost on a daily basis. So things have been selected for different flower and stem and leaf characteristics. So the point is that almost everything we eat has been genetically modified by human selection in one way or another. But it was really the rediscovery of Mendel's work in 1900 that led to the era of scientific plant breeding. One of the milestones was the hybrid corn industry, which began in the 1930s, was very productive. Another milestone was Watson and Crick and others' work to determine the chemical structure of DNA in the 1950s. And this was really the gateway to work in biotechnology. So let me go back to something that you've certainly heard in a biology course at one point or another. And that's that a gene is a DNA segment that encodes a specific protein or RNA that somehow contributes to expression of a trait. So from the DNA segments, we have transcription to the messenger RNA molecule, translation to a protein, and then in some way we have a trait being expressed. As I pointed out before, the power of biotechnology is that basically all forms of life on the planet use this same language. So it is very possible to take a gene from a very distantly related organism, do some tweaking, but you can get it to function in a plant. How are crops genetically altered? This is a graphic produced by the Genetic Literacy Project, which shows a number of methods. On the left, traditional breeding, simply crossing plants together and selecting the favorable offspring. Another method is mutagenesis, which is exposing seeds to chemicals or radiation in the hopes of finding some mutations that are favorable for a particular trait. There is RNA interference, which is a way of switching off or silencing a gene, and then transgenic, which is actually inserting part of a foreign gene into a plant. So that will be the focus of our discussion today. First quiz question. When was the first transgenic plant produced? And there's a range of years you should consider. 1982 was the year of the first transgenic plant, and that was a tobacco plant engineered for antibiotic resistance. This wasn't done because that was an economic trait. It was purely a proof of concept, because tobacco is one of those species that is very easily manipulated in the lab. The first commercial release of a GM crop was the Flavor Savor tomato, 1994. This was on the market all of about 1 year. It turned out it was not a commercial success. The flavor was really not improved, and so it was retired. The initial introduction of large-scale GM crops was 1996, when cotton, corn, and soybeans were all introduced. So a little over 20 years ago. Okay, next question. Fish antifreeze genes have been inserted into strawberries for cold tolerance. The idea is that if you take a gene from an Arctic flounder, which must have some good antifreeze protection mechanisms, if you choose the right gene, you can introduce that into a strawberry and protect the strawberry against freezing damage. So do you think this is true and they're currently on the market? True, and they're in the pipeline for commercialization. True, but only experimentally. Or false? Well, this was true. This was done. The gene was transferred, the strawberry was exposed to freezing temperatures and turned to mush. So it was an unsuccessful experiment. The project was terminated, but the image lives on. Next question deals with Bt crops. Bt is short for Bacillus thuringiensis, a soil-dwelling microorganism which produces a protein that is toxic to certain types of insects, some of which are shown there in the image. The statement is that Bt corn and cotton, with resistance to insect pests, have caused a significant reduction in chemical insecticide use. And this is true. It's one of the major benefits of GM crops is the reduction of chemical insecticide use, and this is especially true in cotton, which traditionally has used large amounts of pesticides. The next question is about herbicide-tolerant crops, and this is the other major class of GM crops currently on the market. What's shown in the photos is conventional soybeans full of weeds, and then a Roundup Ready soybeans in the clean field with all the weeds controlled. So Roundup Ready is a technology that inserts a gene that makes the crop resistant to the effects of the herbicide Roundup. And Roundup is a non-selective herbicide that will kill virtually everything that's green unless they have the Roundup Ready gene. So the statement here, herbicide-tolerant crops have caused a significant reduction in the amount of herbicides applied. Is this true or false? Well, initially it was true. The amount of Roundup that was required was less than traditional herbicides, but that amount of herbicide has increased over time. And that's because some of the weeds have become resistant to the effects of Roundup herbicide. That's what's shown in this graphic, that the use of Roundup and the active ingredient is known as glyphosate. Its use on large areas of several GM crops raises the risk of resistant weeds developing. So across the x-axis we have year, and the y-axis is number of species. So you can see there's been this very dramatic increase so that we now have about 35 species that somewhere in the world have developed resistance. Here's what that looks like in Illinois, where a field that's been sprayed with Roundup is sheltering a very healthy population of resistant horseweed. Here's a great picture from eastern Colorado of kochia. Kochia is one of those plants that can produce thousands of seeds, and it can act as a tumbleweed and blow across the landscape. So that's obviously what happened here. There was one plant, developed resistance, it blew across this field, dropping seeds as it went, so that the following season, after spraying with Roundup, you have this whole line of resistant plants. So this doesn't mean that these fields are lost to agriculture, but it does mean that they would have to use some other forms of weed control in addition to glyphosate. Okay, next question. If pollen from a transgenic crop cross-pollinates a conventional plant, the resulting seeds will not germinate. They'll be sterile. Is this true or false? Well, this is false. The technology does exist, but has never been implemented, and the companies have said that they will never implement this technology. Square watermelons in Japan were created with GMO technology. I guess they must have very small refrigerators in Japan, so a square watermelon would have certain benefits. Is this true or false? Well, this is false. These were just grown in boxes to constrain their growth. GM crops are regulated in the US by, and there are 3 agencies indicated. So you are to decide which of these agencies has a role in regulating GM crops. And you can vote more than once for this question. The answer is that all of the above are involved. They each have their roles defined by Congress, and they are not all involved in every crop. For example, the EPA is only involved where pesticide or pest-resistant traits are involved. However, I should say that an overhaul of the regulatory process for biotech crops is currently underway. This was started under the Obama administration in recognition of the fact that our technology has changed quite a bit, but the regulations have not changed for over 20 years. So things might change a bit in the future. One of the technologies that has caused this change of consideration of regulation is called gene editing. This is something that will be talked about later in part 2 of this webinar, but it has raised questions about whether a gene that's been edited rather than completely inserted from a foreign crop, whether this is a GMO or not, and how will it be regulated. So we'll come back to this question a little later. Here's a tough question, perhaps. How many different GM plant species are currently present, either as fresh produce or part of a processed food product in US food markets? And there's a range of numbers of species. So think about how many of these different crops have GM versions currently commercialized. The answer surprises many people because it's quite small. It's really just 10 crops that are currently on the market. So the next part of this question is to think about what are those crops? And I've already mentioned some of those. I've mentioned corn, soybeans, and cotton, which are the 3 biggest acreage crops. And the other ones are shown here. Canola, alfalfa, sugar beet, all have herbicide-tolerant varieties. And then there's small acreages of papaya and squash for virus resistance, And the newest ones approved are potato and apple, which have been modified for a non-browning trait so that you can slice these, you can keep them on a kitchen counter for a very long time and they will not turn brown. When I first heard about this, I thought that is a very trivial trait. It's purely cosmetic. But then other people in the food industry have told me that there's actually quite a bit of food waste due to browning, where foods are discarded if they turn a brown color. So maybe this is more important than I originally thought. This graph shows the rate of adoption of GM crops in cotton, soybean, and corn by US farmers. So the y-axis showing the percent of the crop area that is planted to GM varieties. And you can see that it's really huge. Over 90% of all of these large acreage crops are GM varieties. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this starts to go down. Part of it is there seems to be a growth in demand for non-GM crops and the cost of GM crops. For every GM trait incorporated into a seed, there's a premium that a farmer must pay for. And economic times are tough on the farm these days, so I would bet that farmers would be looking for more cost-effective options. Here's a picture of virus resistance in papaya with the control non-GM variety on the left and then the viral resistance one on the right. So it's been very effective technically. Economically, the papaya is not accepted in all markets, including in Japan, which is a big market for Hawaiian produce. The first GE drought-tolerant crop was released in 2013 by Monsanto. The picture shows a control version with the small ears with only a few kernels compared to the GE version on the right with these nice healthy-looking ears. The gene is from a bacterium and it produces what's known as an RNA binding protein that protects the gene expression in situations where normally the gene would cease being expressed. Some of the potential GM crops for the future include drought, heat, and cold tolerant. And it seems obvious that climate around the world is being subject to more extreme events. Nutritionally enhanced, you may have heard about golden rice, which is improved for vitamin A. And other applications would include more efficient biofuels, even pharmaceuticals produced in crops. Here's one that if we lived in Florida, we would be very aware of. Citrus greening disease threatens to decimate citrus production in that state. It's a new disease introduced from China and transmitted by this insect shown here. Can have drastic effect on fruit quality and eventually will kill the tree. There is no known resistance in citrus species, but there is a resistance gene from spinach that's been incorporated into orange trees. This is currently undergoing field test. Biofortification of rice. I mentioned golden rice. So these images are showing traditional white rice, the initial version of golden rice, and then the most recent version called Golden Rice 2, which has a much higher content of beta-carotene. It's estimated that given the normal amounts of rice that someone might eat in Asia, that 80% of the vitamin A requirement might be met with golden rice. and thus helping to prevent things like blindness and measles and other diseases. It's not released yet in other countries. I believe the Philippines might be the first country to release golden rice. In Africa, cassava is a very important crop. It's this starchy root crop, which is very productive under stressful environments, but nutritionally not a very good food. So scientists have worked to increase levels of many different nutrients: iron, zinc, protein, vitamin A, vitamin E, and improved other properties as well. I understand that this is undergoing field test in a couple of African countries right now. Here's an application that could really be important in many parts of the world, and it's engineering cereal crops to host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in root nodules the way that legumes do, so that instead of having to apply fertilizer, as this African farmer is doing at the base of the plant, that the cereal crops would obtain their own nitrogen from the atmosphere. It is a major undertaking because it would require many genes, not only to produce the nodules, but then to encode for the chemical reactions. So it's something far out in the future, but potentially could be very revolutionary. So the summary for this part one: virtually everything we eat has been modified genetically by human selection. Nowadays, the meaning of GM implies the use of recombinant DNA technology in the lab to transfer DNA from one organism to another. There are only 10 plant species that have GM crop varieties currently commercialized in the US. Most GM crops are engineered for either insect or herbicide resistance, and future crops might be nutritionally enhanced, tolerant of extreme weather conditions, or improved for many other uses. So, thank you for your attention, and I hope you will now watch part 2 of this webinar.